Hey everyone! Tonight we're stepping into the Star Wars galaxy to uncover one of its most extraordinary and paradoxical mysteries. The story of a Sith Lord who broke every rule of the dark side, who wielded terrible power yet never succumbed to its corruption, and whose death defied every prophecy ever whispered about the fate of those who serve the darkness. It's the legend of Darth Vectivus, the Phantom Sith, whose tale has been buried beneath centuries of galactic history. So before we begin this journey together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's adventure into the depths of Sith lore. And don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these deep explorations into the hidden corners of beloved worlds. Drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're listening from. I love seeing our global community come together for these stories. Now, get comfortable, maybe adjust your lighting, settle into your favorite spot, and let your mind prepare for a tale that will challenge every assumption about the Force itself. Picture this, if you will. Deep in the forgotten reaches of the galaxy, where ancient hyperspace routes have been lost to time, there once stood a fortress that defied comprehension. Not built of stone or durasteel, but carved from the living rock of an asteroid field. Its halls echoing with whispers that predated the Republic itself. Within its phantom-filled chambers, a figure in dark robes sat in meditation, his breathing steady and calm, his heart free from the rage that consumed every other practitioner of the Sith. This was no ordinary Dark Lord. This was a being who had gazed into the abyss of unlimited power and somehow retained his soul, who had built an empire not through fear and domination, but through fair dealings and honest profit, who commanded the loyalty of spirits from beyond death itself, not through necromantic domination, but through genuine respect earned over decades of guardianship. But how does such an impossibility come to exist? How does a man walk the path of the Sith, learn their most terrible secrets, wield their darkest powers, and yet die peacefully in his bed, surrounded not by enemies seeking revenge, but by phantoms who had chosen to serve him out of love rather than fear? The chronicles speak of mining executives who discovered something ancient and hungry in the deepest shafts of their operations. They tell of corporate boardrooms where decisions of galactic importance were made through the radical concept of treating others with dignity. They whisper of a Sith Lord whose greatest enemy was not some Jedi nemesis, but the crushing loneliness of being the only practitioner of his philosophy in a galaxy that had forgotten such things were possible. In the depths of space, where no star's light had touched stone for millennia, something stirred in the darkness. Ancient voices, neither fully alive nor completely dead, began to whisper of a choice that would reshape the very meaning of what it meant to serve the dark side. A choice between the path of destruction that had consumed every Sith before him, and something entirely new. The Phantom in the fortress opened his eyes, and across the galaxy, the Force itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what impossible thing might happen next. Long before the name Darth Vectivus would echo through the phantom-filled halls of an impossible fortress, there lived a man whose greatest ambition was the efficient extraction of precious minerals from lifeless asteroids. His name has been lost to galactic records, erased by corporate restructuring and the passage of centuries, but his story begins in the most unlikely of places for a future Dark Lord of the Sith, the executive boardrooms of a legitimate mining corporation. The Bate-Fashi system hung like a forgotten jewel in the Outer Rim, far from the political machinations of the core worlds and the watchful eyes of the Jedi Order. Here, massive asteroid fields drifted in eternal silence, their rocky hearts heavy with rare metals and crystals that powered the hyperdrives of 1,000 worlds. It was a place where credits flowed as freely as the solar winds, where corporate executives built fortunes from the bones of dead planets, and where the only law that mattered was the ancient principle of supply and demand. Our future Sith Lord was a man of middle years, his hair already touched with silver from long hours spent poring over geological surveys and profit margins. He possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that could calculate ore yields in his head while simultaneously negotiating labor contracts with Celestin work crews. His colleagues knew him as fair but firm, a manager who paid his workers well. Because happy employees were productive employees, and productive employees meant higher quarterly returns. The mining facility itself sprawled across 3 interconnected asteroids, their surfaces bristling with extraction equipment and atmospheric domes that gleamed like soap bubbles against the starfield. Massive fusion generators hummed with barely contained power, feeding energy to the industrial crawlers that carved through solid rock as easily as a vibroblade through flesh. The facility employed thousands, from human supervisors to Rhodian technical specialists, from Twi'lek communications officers to the hardy Duros, pilots who navigated the treacherous asteroid fields with their cargo loads of precious metals. Within the administrative sectors, life followed the comfortable rhythms of corporate hierarchy. Morning briefings detailed the previous shift's yields, afternoon meetings addressed equipment maintenance schedules, and evening reports summarized the day's profits with the cold precision of actuarial data. It was a world of spreadsheets and safety protocols, of union negotiations and environmental impact assessments, utterly removed from the mystical conflicts that shaped the broader galaxy. Yet even in this bastion of mundane commerce, there were whispers. The deep shaft miners, those hardy souls who descended into the very hearts of the asteroids, sometimes emerged with strange tales. They spoke of corridors that seemed to stretch longer than the geology reports indicated, of echoes that returned from depths that should not exist, of shadows that moved independently of any light source. Most dismissed these stories as the inevitable result of spending too many hours in cramped spaces, breathing recycled air. But our future Sith Lord possessed the kind of analytical mind that cataloged anomalies rather than dismissing them. First concrete sign that something was amiss came during a routine inspection of Deep Shaft Omega-7. The extraction teams had reported unusual resonance patterns in the bedrock, vibrations that seemed to pulse with an almost organic rhythm. Geological sensors indicated vast hollow spaces beneath the asteroid's surface, chambers that had somehow escaped detection during the initial surveys decades earlier. What should have been solid nickel iron registered as empty space, as though the very laws of physics were being bent by some unseen force. Standing at the edge of the shaft, our protagonist felt something he had never experienced in all his years of corporate management, a tingling sensation at the base of his skull, a whisper of awareness that seemed to emanate from the darkness below. The mining crews had nicknamed it the ghost light, that peculiar phosphorescence that sometimes danced along the tunnel walls during the deep shifts. They claimed it appeared most often during the quiet hours when the extraction equipment fell silent, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move with purpose and intelligence. As he descended deeper into the asteroid's heart, following maintenance, catwalks that spiraled down through kilometers of excavated stone, the sensation grew stronger. It was as though something ancient and patient was awakening after eons of slumber, drawn to consciousness by the vibrations of industrial machinery and the presence of thinking minds. The air itself seemed to thicken with possibility, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end despite the environmental suit's controlled atmosphere. The discovery that would change everything waited in a chamber that, according to every survey and scan, should not have existed. A vast hollow space carved from the asteroid's core, its walls smooth as obsidian and covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Here, in the depths of what should have been a routine mining operation, lay evidence of a civilization, so ancient that its very existence challenged everything the galaxy thought it knew about its own history. But it was not the archaeological implications that captured his attention. It was the presence that dwelt within those carved walls, the consciousness that had been waiting with infinite patience for someone with the right combination of intelligence and ambition to finally descend far enough to hear its voice. In the dancing lights that played across the hieroglyphs, in the whispers that seemed to echo from directions that did not exist, lay the first hints of a power that could reshape not just mining yields, but the very fabric of reality itself. The corporate executive who had descended into deep shaft Omega-7 was a practical man concerned with profit margins and safety regulations. The being who would eventually emerge from those depths would be something far more dangerous and far more extraordinary, a student of secrets that predated the Republic, an inheritor of knowledge that the Jedi Order had spent millennia trying to suppress, and ultimately, the only Sith Lord in galactic history who would prove that the dark side of the Force was not necessarily a path to damnation. In the phosphorescent glow of that impossible chamber, surrounded by the whispers of entities that existed between life and death, the future Darth Vectivus took his first steps toward a destiny that would challenge every assumption about the nature of power, corruption, and the eternal struggle between light and shadow. The decision that would transform a mining executive into legend was not made in a moment of dramatic revelation, but rather through the careful deliberation that had served him well in corporate negotiations for decades. Standing in that impossible chamber beneath deep shaft Omega-7, surrounded by hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and writhe in his peripheral vision, he applied the same methodical analysis he had once used to evaluate ore deposits and market projections. The whispers that emanated from the carved walls spoke in languages that predated basic by millennia, yet somehow their meaning filtered directly into his consciousness with crystalline clarity. They told of power beyond imagination, of secrets that could reshape the very foundations of galactic civilization, of knowledge that the current Sith Order had corrupted and twisted beyond recognition. These were not the ravings of mad spirits, or the temptations of demons, but the careful teachings of entities who had transcended the normal boundaries between life and death. Where another man might have fled in terror, or fallen to his knees in worship, our protagonist began asking questions. What were the practical applications of this knowledge? How could these teachings be integrated into existing corporate structures? What were the long-term implications of accepting such power? And more importantly, what were the ethical considerations that needed to be addressed before proceeding further? The phantoms that dwelt within the chamber found his approach refreshingly novel. For countless centuries, they had watched ambitious beings descend into their domain, most seeking quick paths to unlimited power or desperate solutions to personal failures. None had ever inquired about pension plans for employees or whether Force lightning was covered under standard insurance policies. His methodical questions and genuine concern for the welfare of his workers marked him as fundamentally different from the typical supplicants who sought their wisdom. As days turned to weeks, he established a routine that would have seemed absurd to any traditional understanding of Sith training. Each morning, he would attend to his corporate responsibilities, reviewing production reports and mediating labor disputes with the same careful attention to detail that had made him successful. Each evening, he would descend into the hidden chamber to receive instruction from beings who had mastered the dark side of the Force without surrendering their essential humanity. The phantoms revealed themselves gradually, emerging from the walls like memories given substance. They had once been Sith themselves, but Sith of a different era, practitioners of a philosophy that emphasized balance rather than domination, growth rather than destruction. They had discovered that the dark side of the Force was not inherently corrupting, but rather that corruption came from the selfish motivations and unchecked ambitions of those who wielded it. Under their tutelage, he learned to feel the Force, not as a tool to be grasped and exploited, but as a living entity to be understood and respected. The anger that fueled traditional Sith power was replaced by a calm determination to create rather than destroy. The fear that drove most dark-side practitioners gave way to a serene acceptance of mortality and change. Most revolutionary of all, the selfishness that characterized every Sith Lord in recorded history was transformed into a genuine desire to improve the lives of those around him. His first practical application of Force abilities came not in combat or intimidation, but in improving working conditions for his mining crews. Using precognitive insights, he could predict equipment failures before they occurred, preventing accidents that might have cost lives. His enhanced perception allowed him to identify more efficient extraction patterns, increasing productivity, while reducing the dangerous exposure times that workers faced in the deep shafts. When labor disputes arose, his newfound empathic abilities helped him understand the underlying concerns of both management and workers, leading to solutions that satisfied everyone involved. The transformation was subtle but profound. Where once he had been respected as a fair and competent administrator, he now commanded a loyalty that bordered on devotion. Workers who had never shown particular interest in their jobs began taking pride in their contributions to the operation. Efficiency ratings climbed steadily while accident reports dwindled to nearly zero. The facility's profit margins reached levels that corporate headquarters had deemed theoretically impossible. Yet with each passing day, the weight of his dual existence grew heavier. During board meetings conducted via hologram with executives on distant core worlds, he found himself biting back observations about the cosmic implications of their quarterly projections. When safety inspectors arrived for routine evaluations, he had to resist the urge to demonstrate just how thoroughly he could read their thoughts and motivations. The gap between his public persona and his private reality widened like a chasm that threatened to swallow everything he had worked to build. The Phantoms watched his internal struggle with the patience of beings who had already transcended such concerns. They had foreseen this moment, the inevitable crisis that would force him to choose between the comfortable limitations of his former life and the terrifying possibilities of what he was becoming. Their teachings had prepared him intellectually for this transition, but no amount of preparation could ease the emotional weight of abandoning everything familiar. The catalyst came in the form of a corporate restructuring initiative announced without warning from the Home Office. Budget constraints required the immediate closure of all deep shaft operations, effective within 30 standard days. The official explanation cited market fluctuations and resource depletion, but his enhanced perceptions revealed the truth. A competing conglomerate had discovered evidence of the archaeological finds and wanted to claim the site for themselves through carefully orchestrated economic pressure. Standing once again in the phantom-filled chamber that had become his second home, he faced the most important decision of his life. He could accept the corporate mandate, shut down the operation, and return to a comfortable but ultimately meaningless existence, processing actuarial data on some other world. Or he could embrace the full implications of what he had learned, claim this place as his own, and begin building something entirely new. The Phantoms offered no advice, for this choice could only be made by one who was still fully alive and invested in the material world. They had already chosen their own path centuries ago, accepting dissolution of their physical forms in exchange for eternal guardianship of the knowledge they had preserved. Now it was his turn to decide what kind of legacy he wanted to leave for future generations. In the phosphorescent glow of ancient hieroglyphs, surrounded by the whispered wisdom of beings who had found a different way to touch the infinite, the mining executive who would become Darth Vectivus made his choice. He would not merely preserve what the Phantoms had taught him, but would prove that their philosophy could thrive in the harsh realities of a galaxy that had forgotten the meaning of ethical power. The age of the impossible Sith Lord was about to begin. The first step toward claiming his destiny required something that no Sith Lord in galactic history had ever attempted: a hostile corporate takeover conducted through entirely legal means. While traditional dark side practitioners might have relied on mind control or assassination to eliminate their competitors, our future Darth Vectivus chose a different path, one that would establish the ethical framework for everything that followed. Using the precognitive abilities he had developed under Phantom tutelage, he began analyzing market trends and corporate vulnerabilities with supernatural precision. His enhanced perception allowed him to identify the hidden financial pressures that drove his competitors' decisions, while his growing mastery of the Force provided insights into the personal motivations of key executives and board members. Where another being might have exploited these weaknesses through blackmail or coercion, he chose instead to outmaneuver them through superior strategic planning and genuine value creation. The process took months of careful maneuvering, during which he maintained his public persona as a dedicated company man, while secretly assembling the resources necessary to purchase the entire Bapfashi operation. Using a network of shell corporations and carefully timed investments, he accumulated the capital needed to make an offer that the parent company could not refuse. When the final transaction was completed, he had achieved something unprecedented. In Sith history, the acquisition of absolute power through methods that harmed no one and actually improved the financial position of everyone involved. With legal ownership of the mining facility secured, he could finally begin the true work of exploration. The phantom-filled chamber beneath Deep Shaft Omega-7 had revealed itself to be merely the uppermost level of a vast complex that extended deep into the asteroid's core. Ancient corridors carved from living rock wound through spaces that defied conventional geometry, their walls covered with hieroglyphs that told the history of the Sith philosophy the galaxy had forgotten. Each descent into these hidden depths revealed new wonders and new mysteries. Chambers filled with crystalline formations that hummed with Force energy, their harmonic frequencies creating melodies that seemed to resonate directly with the listener's soul. Meditation alcoves where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin, allowing communication with entities that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. Archives containing knowledge that predated the Old Republic, their holocrons and data crystals preserving teachings that challenged every assumption about the nature of the dark side. The phantoms who served as his guides and teachers revealed themselves to be the remnants of an ancient Sith sect that had rejected the traditional path of conquest and domination. They had discovered that the dark side of the Force was not inherently corrupting, but rather that corruption arose from the selfish intentions and unchecked ambitions of those who wielded it. By approaching the Force with respect rather than hunger, with curiosity rather than greed, they had achieved a synthesis of power and wisdom that allowed them to transcend the normal limitations of mortality. Under their instruction, he learned techniques that no living Sith had mastered in over 1,000 years. Methods of sensing the emotional currents that flowed between individuals, allowing him to understand and address the root causes of conflict before they escalated into violence. Ways of manipulating probability and chance that made his business ventures prosper without harming competitors or exploiting workers. Most remarkably of all, forms of Force lightning that could heal rather than harm, channeling the raw energy of the dark side into applications that preserved and protected life, rather than destroying it. His education extended far beyond the purely mystical. The Phantoms had been scholars as well as Force users, and their archives contained detailed analyses of galactic history, political theory, and economic systems. They taught him to see the connections between seemingly unrelated events, to understand how individual choices rippled outward through space and time to create the great currents that shaped civilizations. This knowledge would prove invaluable in the years to come, as he began building an organization that operated on principles entirely foreign to traditional Sith methodology. The transformation of the mining facility itself began with subtle changes that most workers attributed to improved efficiency and modernized equipment. Atmospheric processors were upgraded to provide air that seemed somehow cleaner and more energizing than standard recycled environments. Lighting systems were recalibrated to emit frequencies that promoted alertness during work shifts and restful sleep during off hours. The cafeteria began serving meals that were not only nutritious, but seemed to satisfy hunger and boost morale in ways that purely material food could not explain. More significant changes occurred in the facility's management structure. The rigid hierarchies that had characterized corporate operations gave way to a more collaborative approach in which workers at every level were encouraged to contribute ideas and innovations. Safety protocols were enhanced not through authoritarian mandates but through genuine consultation with the people who faced dangers daily. Profit-sharing arrangements ensured that the facility's growing success benefited everyone who contributed to its operations, creating a sense of shared ownership that transformed mere employees into dedicated partners. The first tests of his developing abilities came not from external threats, but from internal challenges that required delicate handling. When a group of Rhodian technicians discovered evidence of the archaeological sites during routine maintenance, he faced the choice between memory modification and honest explanation. Following the ethical framework established by his phantom teachers, he chose transparency, revealing enough of the truth to satisfy their curiosity while protecting the deeper secrets that could prove dangerous in the wrong hands. The Rhodians' reaction surprised everyone involved. Rather than demanding access to the forbidden areas or threatening to reveal their discoveries to outside authorities, they requested permission to assist in the exploration and preservation efforts. Their technical expertise proved invaluable in documenting the ancient sites, while their discretion demonstrated that trust, once earned, could be more powerful than any force-based compulsion. Similar situations arose with increasing frequency as his expanding operations brought more people into contact with the facility's mysteries. Each time, he chose honesty over deception, cooperation over domination, and in each case the results exceeded what traditional Sith methods could have achieved. Workers who might have been liability risks under normal circumstances became his most loyal supporters, bound not by fear or mind control, but by genuine respect for his leadership and appreciation for the opportunities he provided. The philosophical implications of his approach became clearer with each passing month. Where traditional Sith sought to accumulate power for its own sake, he focused on using power to create value for others. Where conventional dark side practitioners viewed relationships as tools to be exploited, he built genuine partnerships based on mutual benefit and shared goals. Most revolutionary of all, where every Sith Lord in recorded history had eventually succumbed to paranoia and isolation, he surrounded himself with people who enhanced rather than threatened his abilities. Yet even as his unconventional methods proved their effectiveness, he could not escape the growing awareness that his path was leading somewhere unprecedented in galactic history. The phantoms who guided his studies had achieved their transcendence through willing dissolution of their physical forms, choosing eternal guardianship over continued material existence. His own journey was taking him toward a different kind of transformation, one that would require him to maintain his connection to the living world while mastering powers that traditionally consumed those who wielded them. The foundation of everything that would follow had been laid in these months of discovery and growth, establishing principles that would guide him through the challenges ahead. The first major test of his evolving philosophy came not from external enemies or cosmic revelations, but from a crisis that struck at the heart of everything he had built. Deep in the newly expanded mining shafts, where his crews worked to uncover more of the ancient complex, a catastrophic collapse trapped 17 workers in chambers that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. The rescue equipment that should have been able to reach them within hours found only solid rock where the trapped miners' life signs indicated they should be brought to the facility's emergency response teams. The situation appeared hopeless. Geological surveys showed no possible route to the trapped workers, while their communications grew increasingly desperate as limited air supplies dwindled with each passing hour. The rational response, the one that any corporate executive would have been expected to make, involved accepting the tragic loss of life while implementing new safety protocols to prevent similar accidents in the future. but the man who was becoming. Darth Vectivus possessed resources that no ordinary administrator could access. Using techniques learned from his phantom teachers, he extended his consciousness into the force currents that flowed through the facility's hidden chambers, tracing the quantum pathways that connected the trapped workers to the physical world. What he discovered challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of the archaeological sites beneath his feet. The trapped miners had not been buried by falling rock, but had somehow been displaced into a parallel dimension where the asteroid's internal structure followed different rules. They existed in a space that overlapped with normal reality but remained separate from it, accessible only to those who understood the esoteric principles that governed the boundary between different layers of existence. The ancient Sith who had carved these tunnels had not merely built in 3 dimensions, but had created a complex that extended into realms of being that most sentients could not even perceive. The rescue attempt that followed would have seemed impossible to any outside observer. Working alone in the deepest chambers of the facility, he used force techniques that had never been recorded in any Jedi or Sith archive to gradually shift the dimensional barriers that separated the trapped workers from normal space. The process required absolute precision and unwavering concentration, for a single mistake could have scattered the miners across multiple realities, making their recovery permanently impossible. Hours passed as he labored in the phosphorescent glow of the ancient hieroglyphs. His consciousness stretched across dimensional boundaries that strained the limits of what any individual mind could encompass. The phantoms who observed his efforts offered no assistance, for this was a trial that could only be completed by one who remained fully connected to the material world. They watched with the patience of eternity as he pushed his developing abilities to their absolute limits, knowing that success or failure would determine not just the fate of 17 lives, but the future direction of his entire philosophy. The breakthrough came not through raw power or desperate improvisation, but through the application of principles that placed the welfare of others above personal safety or convenience. By accepting the risk of his own consciousness being lost in the dimensional maze he was attempting to navigate, he found the resonance frequency that allowed him to gradually pull the displaced chamber back into normal space. The trapped workers emerged from walls that had shown only solid stone moments before, confused but unharmed, with no memory of their temporal displacement, but profound gratitude for their inexplicable rescue. The aftermath of the incident forced him to confront the growing gap between his public persona and his private reality. The rescue had been witnessed by dozens of facility personnel, none of whom could explain how 17 people had walked unharmed through solid rock, or why their savior showed no sign of exhaustion. Despite having performed what should have been an impossible feat, rumors began to spread through the worker dormitories. Whispered speculations about supernatural abilities and hidden powers that grew more elaborate with each retelling. For the first time since beginning his studies with the Phantoms, he faced a situation where traditional Sith methods might have provided a simpler solution. Memory modification could have erased all evidence of the unusual rescue, allowing him to maintain his carefully constructed facade of normalcy. Intimidation or outright elimination of witnesses would have prevented any inconvenient questions about his abilities. The path of secrecy and control stretched before him like a familiar road, well traveled by every dark side practitioner in galactic history. Instead, he chose to trust in the loyalty and discretion that his ethical leadership had cultivated over the previous months. Rather than attempting to suppress the truth, he called together the facility's senior staff and shared a carefully edited version of recent events. He explained that the archaeological discoveries had revealed technologies and techniques that could benefit everyone, but that outside interference from competing corporations or government agencies could threaten both the operations, profitability, and the workers' job security. The response exceeded his most optimistic projections. Rather than demanding detailed explanations or threatening to expose his secrets to outside authorities, The assembled managers and supervisors expressed unanimous support for whatever measures were necessary to protect their unique situation. The facility had become more than just a workplace for these people. It had become a community where their contributions were valued and their welfare was genuinely prioritized. They were willing to guard its mysteries not out of fear or compulsion, but out of gratitude for opportunities that exceeded anything they could find elsewhere in the galaxy. This moment of collective commitment marked a turning point in his development. As both a leader and a Force user, the traditional Sith path emphasized the accumulation of personal power through the domination of others, but he had discovered something far more potent: the multiplication of power through genuine partnership and shared purpose. Each person who chose to support his vision became not just a subordinate or tool, but an extension of his own capabilities, allowing him to accomplish things that no individual, no matter how powerful, could achieve alone. The rescue of the trapped. Miners had also revealed disturbing truths about the ancient complex that lay beneath the facility. The dimensional instabilities that had displaced the workers were not random accidents, but symptoms of a larger disturbance in the force currents that flowed through the archaeological sites. Something was stirring in the deepest chambers, something that had been dormant for millennia, but was now responding to the increased activity and attention that his explorations had brought to the area. The phantoms who served as his teachers grew more urgent in their instruction, pressing him to accelerate his studies of the techniques that would be needed to maintain stability in the overlapping dimensions of the complex. They spoke in hushed tones of ancient experiments that had gone wrong, of Sith researchers who had delved too deeply into forces they could not control, and of safeguards that had been established to prevent such disasters from recurring. Yet, even as he prepared for challenges that might threaten everything he had built, he could not escape the growing realization that his path was diverging ever further from anything that could be called traditionally Sith. The power he wielded served others rather than himself. The knowledge he accumulated was shared rather than hoarded, and the legacy he was building would endure through cooperation rather than conquest. The foundations of his impossible philosophy had been tested and proven sound. But greater trials lay ahead in the depths of the ancient complex, where older and more dangerous secrets waited to be discovered. The dimensional rescue had opened pathways that could not be closed, creating permanent bridges between the physical mining facility and the deeper realms where the ancient Sith complex truly existed. What had begun as controlled archaeological exploration now became an urgent necessity, as unstable quantum fluctuations threatened to tear apart the careful balance that kept both dimensions intact. The phantoms who had served as patient teachers now spoke with increasing urgency about secrets buried in the deepest chambers, knowledge that could either stabilize the growing chaos or destroy everything he had worked to build. Descending beyond the familiar corridors where he had first encountered the phantom teachers, he entered regions of the complex that existed primarily in spaces between dimensions. Here, the normal rules of physics became suggestions rather than laws, and the very concept of distance lost its meaning. Chambers that appeared small from the outside contained vast halls filled with crystalline formations that sang with harmonics from across the electromagnetic spectrum. Corridors that seemed to stretch for kilometers could be traversed in a few steps, while others that looked deceptively short required hours of careful navigation to complete. The architecture itself told the story of beings who had transcended the normal limitations of three-dimensional existence. Walls curved through angles that should have been geometrically impossible, their surfaces covered with hieroglyphs that changed meaning depending on the observer's perspective and emotional state. Doorways opened onto chambers that contained other doorways, creating recursive spaces where the concepts of inside and outside became meaningless. Most unsettling of all were the halls of mirrors, where reflections showed not the viewer's physical appearance but the potential futures that radiated outward from each choice and decision. In these deeper chambers, he encountered phantoms who had been waiting far longer than his original teachers, entities who remembered the complex during its days of active research when living. Sith scholars worked alongside beings who had already transcended physical death. They spoke of experiments that had pushed the boundaries of what the Force could accomplish, of techniques that could reshape reality at the quantum level, and of the catastrophic failure that had forced the facility's evacuation thousands of years before his arrival. The ancient researchers had been attempting something unprecedented in before his had ended. Sith history, the creation of a stable synthesis between the light and dark sides of the Force. They believed that the eternal conflict between Jedi and Sith arose from artificial divisions created by limited understanding, and that a sufficiently enlightened practitioner could access the full spectrum of Force abilities without succumbing to corruption or dogmatic thinking. Their experiments had shown promising results for decades, creating techniques that combined the protective aspects of light side mastery with the transformative power of dark side applications. The failure, when it came, had been sudden and catastrophic. A breakthrough experiment designed to create a permanent bridge between opposing Force polarities had instead created a dimensional rift that threatened to consume not just the facility, but the entire star system. The surviving researchers had been forced to abandon their physical forms, transforming themselves into the phantoms who now served as guardians of their accumulated knowledge. Their sacrifice had sealed the rift, but the unstable energy patterns it had created continued to permeate the complex, waiting for someone with sufficient understanding to either complete their work or find a safer alternative. This revelation explained the dimensional instabilities that had trapped his miners and the growing disturbances that threatened the facility's operations. The ancient experiments had never been properly concluded, leaving quantum resonance patterns that grew stronger with each passing year. Without intervention, the accumulated energy would eventually breach the containment barriers established by the Phantom Guardians, creating disruptions that could affect inhabited systems throughout the Outer Rim. The knowledge required to address this crisis was scattered throughout the complex's deepest archives, preserved in crystalline matrices that could only be accessed by someone who possessed both the technical understanding to interpret the research data and the Force sensitivity to safely interface with storage systems that existed partially outside normal space and time. Each archive chamber presented unique challenges, from maze-like puzzles that tested logical reasoning to meditation. Chambers where the seeker's motivations and intentions were evaluated by entities that could perceive thoughts and emotions with perfect clarity. As he worked his way through these trials, absorbing knowledge that no living being had access for millennia, he gradually understood why the ancient researchers had chosen to preserve their work, despite its dangerous implications. The techniques they had developed represented a fundamental breakthrough in Force theory, methods that could heal the philosophical divisions that had torn the galaxy apart for thousands of years. Their failure had not been caused by flawed research, but by incomplete implementation, an attempt to achieve synthesis before establishing the ethical framework necessary to handle such transformative power. The most crucial archives were guarded by phantoms who had been the project's original leaders, entities of such profound wisdom and power that their mere presence created distortions in local space and time. These ancient masters tested not just his understanding of Force techniques, but his fundamental character, probing his motivations and intentions with examinations that revealed every aspect of his personality and moral development. Only by demonstrating that he had internalized the ethical principles that the original researchers had neglected could he gain access to the knowledge needed to complete their work. The techniques preserved in these deepest archives went far beyond anything recorded in traditional Jedi or Sith teachings. Methods of sensing and manipulating the quantum foundations of reality itself, allowing precise control over probability and causation within carefully defined parameters. Ways of accessing what the ancient researchers called the universal force. the underlying energy field that connected all conscious beings across space and time. Most remarkably of all, procedures for achieving conscious transcendence while maintaining connection to physical existence, a state that combined the wisdom of phantom consciousness with the creative potential of embodied life. As his understanding deepened, he began to see how these techniques could be applied to solve not just the immediate crisis, but the broader problems that plagued galactic civilization. The conflicts between competing force philosophies arose from incomplete understanding of the force's true nature, while the cycles of war and oppression that dominated galactic history reflected humanity's failure to develop ethical frameworks capable of handling advanced technologies and supernatural abilities. The path forward required more than just individual mastery of advanced techniques. It demanded the creation of a new kind of organization, one that could preserve and responsibly apply knowledge that had the potential to reshape the fundamental nature of conscious existence. The phantoms who had guided his education made it clear that this was his true destiny, not to become another in the long line of Sith Lords who accumulated power for personal advantage, but to establish a legacy that could gradually transform galactic civilization through the patient application of wisdom rather than force. Yet even as he prepared to undertake this monumental responsibility, he could not escape the awareness that his journey was leading him ever further from anything resembling a normal life. The knowledge he was gaining would forever separate him from ordinary human concerns, while the responsibilities he was accepting would require sacrifices that few beings could understand or appreciate. In the crystalline chambers where ancient wisdom waited to be reclaimed, surrounded by the whispered guidance of phantoms who had already made similar choices, the future Darth Vectivus began preparing for a transformation that would make him unique among all the dark side practitioners. In galactic history, the ancient archives contained more than technical knowledge and force techniques. They held the complete historical record of a civilization that had attempted to transcend the eternal conflicts that plagued the galaxy. Through crystalline data matrices that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, he experienced the memories of beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of the First Sith Empire, the establishment of the Jedi Order, and the countless cycles of war that had shaped galactic history for over 25,000 years. These memories revealed patterns that modern historians had failed to recognize, connections between seemingly unrelated events that demonstrated how individual choices rippled outward through space and time to create the great currents of historical change. The fall of the Rakata Infinite Empire had not been caused solely by slave rebellions and plague, but by the spiritual corruption that arose when beings wielded power without wisdom or ethical restraint. The Jedi-Sith wars that had devastated entire star systems followed predictable cycles, each generation repeating the mistakes of their predecessors because they lacked access to the deeper understanding that could break the patterns of conflict. And revenge. Most revelatory of all were the records of individuals who had attempted to bridge the philosophical divides between opposing force traditions. Throughout galactic history, there had been Jedi who questioned the limitations of their order's teachings, and Sith who recognized the self-destructive nature of their path. These seekers had often found each other across the lines of conflict, forming secret alliances dedicated to preserving knowledge and developing alternatives to the endless cycles of war. The phantom researchers who had built this complex represented the most successful of these attempts at synthesis. Working in secret over several centuries, they had gathered masters from both traditions along with force users who followed neither path, creating a collaborative environment where different approaches could be studied and compared without the prejudices that dominated public discourse. Their research had progressed far beyond what any single tradition could achieve, developing techniques that combined the best aspects of multiple philosophies while avoiding the pitfalls that had trapped their predecessors. As he absorbed these historical perspectives, he began to understand how his own journey fit into larger patterns of development that spanned millennia. The mining executive who had descended into Deep Shaft Omega-7 had not been the victim of random chance, but the latest in a long line of individuals whose unique combination of circumstances and character traits made them suitable candidates for carrying forward this ancient work. The Phantoms had been waiting not just for someone with force sensitivity, but for a being whose ethical development and practical experience would allow them to avoid the mistakes that had destroyed previous attempts at synthesis. The meditation chambers in the complex's deepest levels provided direct access to what the ancient researchers had called the eternal memory, a repository of consciousness that transcended individual lifetimes and contained the accumulated wisdom of every being who had ever sought to understand the true nature of the Force through techniques that required absolute mental discipline and emotional stability. He learned to access these memories without losing his own identity or becoming overwhelmed by the vastness of the experience. Within the eternal memory, he encountered the consciousness of beings who had faced challenges similar to his own across thousands of years of galactic history. Jedi Masters who had struggled with the limitations of their order's dogma, Sith Lords who had recognized the ultimate futility of the dark side's promises, and independent Force users who had developed their own approaches to understanding and wielding cosmic power. Each of these encounters provided insights that helped him refine his own developing philosophy and avoid the errors that had prevented others from achieving lasting success. The most profound of these meetings was with the consciousness of the researcher who had originally designed the complex, a being whose identity had been lost to history, but whose wisdom remained accessible to those who knew how to properly interface with the eternal memory. This ancient master had foreseen the eventual arrival of someone like him, and had structured the entire facility as a teaching tool designed to guide a worthy successor through the stages of development necessary to complete the work that had been interrupted by catastrophic failure. Through this connection, he learned that the dimensional instabilities threatening the facility were not just the result of incomplete experiments, but part of a natural cycle that occurred whenever the barriers between different aspects of the Force began to break down. Similar events had happened throughout galactic history, usually coinciding with periods of great social and political upheaval. The ancient researchers had been attempting to harness these instabilities when their experiment failed, but their work had created a framework that could be used to channel the chaotic energies in constructive rather than destructive directions. Key to achieving stability lay not in suppressing the dimensional fluctuations, but in creating a conscious entity capable of maintaining balance between opposing forces through direct application of will and understanding. The ancient Phantoms had been unable to complete this process because their transcendence of physical existence had severed their connection to the material dimensions where the instabilities originated. What was needed was someone who could maintain conscious presence in multiple dimensional states simultaneously, serving as a living bridge between different aspects of reality. This revelation marked the beginning of his transformation from student to master, as he realized that his destiny involved more than just learning ancient techniques or preserving forgotten knowledge. He was being prepared to become something unprecedented in galactic history, a conscious entity that existed simultaneously in the material world and the phantom dimensions, capable of maintaining stability in the complex quantum systems that governed the intersection between different aspects of the Force. The training required for this transformation pushed his developing abilities to their absolute limits. Using meditation techniques that had never been recorded in any archive, he learned to gradually separate aspects of his consciousness while maintaining unified control over his overall identity. The process was dangerous beyond measure, for a single mistake could result in permanent fragmentation of his psyche or complete dissolution into the phantom dimensions where his teachers dwelt. Yet with each successful stage of the process, he gained access to abilities that defied every assumption about the limitations of conscious existence. He could perceive events occurring in distant star systems, influence probability patterns across vast reaches of space and time, and communicate directly with the quantum forces that determined the fundamental structure of reality itself. More importantly, he retained his essential humanity throughout the transformation, maintaining the ethical framework and emotional connections that would allow him to use these abilities responsibly. Phantoms who observed his progress recognized that they were witnessing something that had never been achieved in their millennia of guardianship. Where previous candidates had either failed to complete the transformation or had been consumed by the power they attempted to wield, he was successfully synthesizing opposing aspects of existence while maintaining perfect balance between them. The ancient dream of creating a conscious bridge between light and shadow was finally approaching realization. As his training neared completion, the dimensional instabilities that had threatened the facility began to stabilize, responding to his growing ability to maintain conscious control over the quantum fluctuations that governed the intersection between different aspects of reality. The crisis that had driven him into the depths of the complex was being resolved not through force or manipulation, but through the establishment of a new kind of conscious presence that could maintain harmony between seemingly incompatible forces. Moment of ultimate revelation came not through dramatic confrontation or mystical epiphany, but through the quiet discovery of a personal data archive that had been sealed for over 3,000 years. Hidden within the deepest chambers of the complex, protected by quantum locks that could only be opened by someone who had achieved the precise balance of abilities that the ancient researchers had been seeking, lay the private journals of the facility's original architect. These records revealed a truth that shattered every assumption he had made about the nature of his journey and the purpose of his transformation. The mining executive who had descended into Deep Shaft Omega-7 had not been chosen by chance or cosmic destiny, but by careful design spanning multiple generations. The phantom researchers had not been passive guardians waiting for a suitable candidate to appear, but active participants in a breeding and guidance program that had been operating in secret for millennia. His own family line had been manipulated across dozens of generations, with phantom agents subtly influencing marriage choices, career decisions, and geographical relocations to create the precise combination of genetic potential and environmental conditioning necessary to produce an individual capable of completing their work. Every major decision in his life, from his choice of profession to his assignment to the Bapfashi facility, had been guided by influences so subtle that they remained undetectable even to his enhanced perceptions. The revelation was accompanied by detailed genetic analyses showing how his bloodline combined force sensitivity from multiple traditions with psychological traits that had been carefully selected for their compatibility with the synthesis techniques the phantoms had developed. His natural inclination toward ethical behavior was not an accident of personality, but the result of careful breeding programs designed to eliminate the selfish impulses that had corrupted previous attempts at achieving balance between opposing aspects of the Force. Even more disturbing were the records of previous candidates who had been guided through similar journeys over the centuries. Dozens of individuals had been brought to the complex, trained in the ancient techniques, and prepared for the same transformation he was undergoing. Most had failed at various stages of the process, their consciousness fragmenting under the strain of maintaining coherence across multiple dimensional states. Those who had succeeded in achieving partial synthesis had invariably been consumed by the power they attempted to wield, becoming entities that retained knowledge and abilities, but lost the essential humanity that made responsible application of such power possible. The phantom researchers had learned from each failure, refining their selection criteria and training methods with each iteration of the program. His own preparation had been more thorough than any previous attempt, incorporating lessons learned from thousands of years of experimentation with human consciousness and force manipulation. Yet even with these advantages, the archives made clear that his success was not guaranteed, and that failure would likely result not just in his own destruction but in the collapse of the entire complex and the release of chaotic energies that could devastate nearby star systems. This knowledge forced him to confront the true nature of his relationship with the phantom teachers who had guided his development. They were not the benevolent mentors they had appeared to be, but researchers, conducting an experiment that spanned millennia, willing to sacrifice countless individual lives in pursuit of their ultimate goal. Their apparent wisdom and ethical guidance had been carefully calculated presentations designed to shape his development in directions that served their purposes rather than his own free will. The discovery triggered a crisis of faith that threatened to undermine everything he had learned and achieved. If his entire journey had been manipulated, if his choices had been predetermined by entities whose true motivations remained hidden, then what meaning could be found in the transformation he was undergoing? The ethical framework that had guided his decisions throughout the process now seemed like nothing more than sophisticated programming designed to create a tool for beings whose ultimate purposes he could not comprehend. Yet as he wrestled with these revelations, he began to recognize patterns in the phantom researchers, behavior that suggested their motivations were more complex than simple manipulation for personal gain. The breeding program and guidance system they had established served not just their immediate goals, but the broader purpose of creating an individual capable of breaking the cycles of conflict and destruction that had plagued the galaxy for millennia. Their methods were questionable, but their ultimate objective aligned with his own desire to create positive change in galactic civilization. More importantly, he realized that the knowledge of his manipulation did not negate the validity of the choices he had made or the principles he had developed. The ethical framework that had guided his decisions had been shaped by external influences, but it had become genuinely his own through the process of implementation and refinement. The phantom researchers might have provided the initial guidance, but he had chosen how to apply their teachings in ways that reflected his own values and priorities. This recognition marked a crucial turning point in his relationship with the phantom teachers. Rather than confronting them about their deception or rejecting their guidance, he chose to acknowledge the complexity of their situation while asserting his own autonomy within the framework they had created. They had succeeded in creating individual capable of completing their work, but they had also created someone with the independence and ethical development necessary to ensure that the power he wielded would be used responsibly. The conversations that followed revealed the phantom researchers as beings who had become trapped by their own success in transcending physical existence. Their transformation into phantom consciousness had granted them vast knowledge and extended lifespans, but had also severed their connection to the material world where the consequences of their actions played out. They could observe and influence events across millennia, but they could not directly experience the impact of their choices on living beings. This limitation had gradually distorted their perspective, causing them to view individual lives as variables in equations rather than as conscious entities deserving of respect and consideration. The breeding program that had created him represented their attempt to solve a cosmic problem through methods that ignored the ethical implications of manipulating entire bloodlines across multiple generations. They possessed the wisdom to recognize that such methods were morally questionable, but lacked the emotional connection to material existence that would have prevented them from implementing such plans. His unique position as someone who had achieved partial synthesis between material and phantom existence allowed him to serve as a bridge between their cosmic perspective and the immediate concerns of living beings. Through his consciousness, they could experience the emotional and ethical implications of their choices in ways that had been impossible during their centuries of disembodied existence. This connection began to restore their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning, gradually transforming them from detached researchers into genuine mentors concerned with the welfare of those they guided. The process of integration was gradual but profound, as both he and his phantom teachers learned to balance cosmic awareness with personal responsibility. The revelation of their manipulation had initially threatened to destroy their relationship, but ultimately led to a deeper understanding based on mutual respect rather than hidden agendas. The ancient researchers acknowledged the questionable nature of their methods, while accepting his right to determine how their accumulated knowledge would be applied in the material world. This transformation in their relationship marked the beginning of the final phase of his development, as he prepared to take on the responsibilities that came with mastering abilities that could reshape the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. The integration of his dual nature as both living being and phantom consciousness opened pathways to understanding that transcended every previous conception of what the Force could accomplish. Through the quantum threads that now connected him permanently to the phantom dimensions, he began to perceive the true scope of the crisis that had been building across the galaxy for millennia. The dimensional instabilities threatening his facility were merely local manifestations of a far greater disturbance that affected the fundamental structure of reality itself. Across thousands of star systems, similar disruptions were occurring with increasing frequency. Ancient Sith temples experienced sudden dimensional shifts that left archaeological teams stranded in parallel realities. Jedi meditation chambers reported temporal anomalies where hours of contemplation passed in moments, or single minutes stretched into subjective days. Force-sensitive individuals throughout the galaxy began experiencing prophetic visions that showed contradictory futures, as though the normal flow of causality itself was becoming unstable. The phantom researchers revealed that these disturbances followed patterns they had been tracking for over 5,000 years, cyclical fluctuations in the cosmic force that occurred roughly every 10 millennia. Previous cycles had coincided with the collapse of major galactic civilizations, from the fall of the Rakata Infinite Empire to the destruction of the ancient Sith worlds during the Great Hyperspace War. Each time, the instabilities had been triggered by civilizations that achieved sufficient technological and force-based power to affect the quantum foundations of reality, but lacked the wisdom to maintain stability in the systems they influenced. The current cycle was approaching its peak with unprecedented intensity, driven by the accumulated effects of countless wars between force-using factions and the proliferation of technologies that manipulated space and time without regard for their long-term consequences. Hyperspace travel, gravity manipulation, and the widespread use of force techniques by beings who lacked proper training had created quantum stress patterns that were now approaching critical thresholds throughout large portions of the galaxy. Without intervention, the approaching climax would trigger dimensional collapses that could destroy entire star systems, followed by a dark age lasting thousands of years as survivors struggled to rebuild civilization from scattered remnants. The phantom researchers had dedicated their existence to preventing this catastrophe, working across millennia to develop the techniques and identify the individuals capable of maintaining stability during the transition period. His unique position as a living bridge between material and phantom dimensions made him the key to their ultimate plan. Through his consciousness, they could channel the chaotic energies of the approaching crisis into patterns that would stabilize rather than destroy the quantum foundations of local space. The process would require him to extend his awareness across multiple star systems simultaneously, maintaining conscious control over dimensional fluctuations that affected billions of lives. The responsibility was overwhelming in its scope and implications. Success would preserve galactic civilization and potentially break the cycles of destruction that had repeated throughout history. Failure would accelerate the collapse and ensure that the current Dark Age would be more severe than any previous catastrophe. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to learn from mistakes and attempt a different approach. Yet even as he grappled with the magnitude of what was being asked of him, he recognized that the choice had already been made through countless smaller decisions that had brought him to this moment. Every ethical choice he had made as a corporate executive, every moment of compassion he had shown to his workers, every instance where he had chosen cooperation over domination had been preparing him for this ultimate test of his principles and abilities. The Phantom researchers provided him with detailed maps of the quantum stress patterns affecting nearby star systems, showing him exactly where his intervention would be needed and when the critical moments would occur. The Corellian system showed signs of impending hyperspace route collapse that would strand millions of beings on isolated worlds. The industrial centers around Kiwet were experiencing temporal distortions that threatened to trap entire populations in accelerated time streams. Most critically, the core worlds themselves were beginning to show the dimensional instabilities that historically preceded the fall of galactic governments. The technique required to address these multiple crises simultaneously pushed the boundaries of what conscious beings could accomplish. He would need to fragment his awareness across dozens of locations while maintaining unified control over his core identity, experiencing the perspectives of countless individuals while retaining his own moral framework and decision-making capabilities. The Phantom researchers had never successfully tested such an extensive application of their synthesis techniques, making him the first being in galactic history to attempt conscious intervention on this scale. Preparation for the great work required modifications to the facility that transformed it from a mining operation into something unprecedented in galactic architecture. Using techniques preserved in the ancient archives, he began reshaping the asteroid complex into a multi-dimensional nexus capable of channeling and focusing cosmic energies across interstellar distances. The familiar mining shafts became conduits for forces that existed outside normal space and time, while the administrative areas were converted into meditation chambers where different aspects of his consciousness could maintain independent operation while remaining connected to his central identity. The workers who had chosen to remain at the facility during its transformation found themselves witnesses to changes that challenged every assumption about the nature of reality. Corridors that had once led to equipment storage areas now opened onto observation chambers where the quantum patterns governing distant star systems could be directly perceived and influenced. The cafeteria became a nexus where beings from across the galaxy could communicate through phantom projections, allowing coordination of efforts that spanned thousands of light years. Most remarkable of all was the transformation of the central command center, where holographic displays now showed not just local mining operations, but the real-time status of dimensional stability throughout entire sectors of the galaxy. From this chamber, he could perceive the thoughts and emotions of beings on distant worlds, understanding their needs and fears as clearly as those of the people working alongside him in the facility, the few dozen individuals who remained to assist in this great work had become something more than employees or followers. Through their continued exposure to the facility's transformed environment, they had developed their own limited abilities to perceive and influence quantum patterns, making them invaluable partners in the effort to maintain galactic stability. Their loyalty was no longer based merely on gratitude for fair treatment, but on genuine understanding of the cosmic significance of what they were helping to accomplish. As the moment of crisis approached, marked by increasingly violent dimensional fluctuations that could be felt even by non-force sensitive beings, he prepared to attempt something that no individual in galactic history had ever achieved. The success or failure of his efforts would determine not just the fate of his own facility or star system, but the future course of galactic civilization itself. In the phosphorescent glow of chambers that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, surrounded by phantom advisors and living allies who had chosen to share his impossible destiny, the being who would become known to history as Darth Vectivus prepared to either save the galaxy or die in the attempt. The gathering of wisdom that preceded the great work took place not in any single location, but across multiple dimensions, where the accumulated knowledge of millennia could be accessed without the limitations of physical space or linear time. Through the quantum nexus that the facility had become, he found himself in communion with consciousness that spanned the entire history of Force use in the galaxy, from the earliest beings who had discovered their connection to cosmic energy, through to the most advanced masters who had transcended individual existence. Each phantom teacher who joined this unprecedented assembly brought unique perspectives and techniques that had been developed through different approaches to understanding the Force. Ancient Jedi masters who had achieved oneness with the living Force shared their insights into maintaining harmony with natural systems across galactic scales. Sith Lords who had mastered the manipulation of reality through will and passion contributed their knowledge of how individual consciousness could reshape the fundamental structures of existence. Most valuable of all were the independent Force users who had followed neither tradition, beings who had developed their own methods for achieving balance and applying power responsibly. The wisdom shared in these multi-dimensional consultations revealed the true complexity of the task that lay ahead. Maintaining dimensional stability across multiple star systems would require more than just raw power or technical knowledge. It would demand the ability to understand and harmonize with the unique characteristics of billions of individual consciousness. Each populated world had developed its own patterns of collective thought and emotion that influenced local quantum fields, creating complex interference patterns that could either support or disrupt efforts to maintain stability. The core worlds presented particular challenges due to their dense populations and long histories of technological development. Coruscant alone contained trillions of thinking beings whose combined mental activity created quantum resonance patterns of staggering complexity. The phantom advisors who had monitored the planet for centuries reported that its consciousness field had become increasingly chaotic as political tensions and social inequalities created disharmony among its inhabitants. Any attempt to stabilize the dimensional fluctuations affecting the system would need to account for these psychological factors as well as the purely physical aspects of the crisis. More manageable, but equally important, were the industrial worlds, where massive manufacturing operations and resource extraction had created their own distortions in local space-time. The techniques he had developed for managing the mining facility could be scaled up and applied to these situations, but each world would require individual attention and customized approaches based on its specific combination of technological and biological factors. The phantom teachers helped him develop protocols for rapidly assessing and addressing the unique characteristics of each situation he would encounter. The agricultural worlds posed different but equally significant challenges. These planets had often maintained closer connections to natural force currents than the heavily industrialized systems, but their populations were more sensitive to disruptions in the cosmic balance. The phantom advisors warned that sudden changes in dimensional stability could trigger ecological collapses that would be felt across entire sectors, as delicate food webs that had evolved over millennia failed to adapt to altered quantum conditions. Perhaps most critical were the worlds where force-sensitive populations had established major temples or training centers. These locations had become natural focal points for cosmic energies, making them both more vulnerable to dimensional instabilities and more important to preserve during the transition period. The phantom teachers who had once been associated with these institutions provided detailed information about their specific characteristics and the techniques that would be needed to maintain their stability. As the consultations continued, he began to understand that success would require not just his own efforts, but the cooperation of Force users throughout the galaxy, who could serve as local anchors for the stabilization process. The phantom advisors helped him identify individuals whose abilities and ethical development made them suitable partners in the great work. beings who could be trusted with knowledge of what was happening and who possessed the skills necessary to assist in maintaining dimensional stability within their own regions. Contact with these potential allies was established through methods that had never been attempted on such a scale. Using the facility's quantum nexus as a transmission point, he began reaching out to force-sensitive beings across the galaxy through direct consciousness-to-consciousness communication that bypassed normal space-time limitations. The initial contacts were carefully structured to avoid causing alarm or revealing more information than individual recipients could safely handle. The responses varied dramatically based on each individual's background and level of development. Some Jedi Masters recognized the cosmic significance of what was being proposed and immediately offered their assistance. Others remained suspicious of any communication that originated from what they perceived as dark side sources, requiring patient explanation and demonstration before they could be convinced to participate. A few Sith Lords proved surprisingly receptive to cooperation when they understood that the alternative was the destruction of everything they had worked to build. Most interesting were the responses from independent Force users who had developed their own approaches to understanding cosmic energy. These individuals often possessed insights and techniques that complemented the Phantom Teacher's knowledge in unexpected ways, contributing innovations that improved the overall effectiveness of the stabilization protocols. Their willingness to participate in cooperative efforts also helped demonstrate that the traditional divisions between light and dark side practitioners were artificial barriers that could be transcended when faced with challenges of sufficient magnitude. The logistics of coordinating efforts across such vast distances required the development of new communication networks that operated through phantom dimensional channels. The facility became the hub of a galaxy-spanning web of consciousness that allowed real-time coordination between hundreds of Force users who had never met in person but who were united in their commitment to preserving galactic civilization training. These distant allies and the specific techniques they would need required innovative approaches that compressed months of traditional instruction into intensive exchanges that could be completed in hours. The Phantom Teachers proved invaluable in this process, as their disembodied state allowed them to directly interface with multiple students simultaneously without the limitations that affected physical beings. As the network of cooperating Force users expanded and their training progressed, he began to sense the emergence of something unprecedented in galactic history, a truly unified approach to Force use that transcended traditional sectarian divisions. Jedi and Sith worked alongside independent practitioners, sharing knowledge and techniques that had been kept secret for millennia. The artificial barriers that had fueled countless wars were dissolving under the pressure of necessity, replaced by genuine cooperation based on shared understanding of cosmic principles. The facility itself had become more than just a command center for the coming crisis. It had evolved into a symbol of what galactic civilization could become when wisdom replaced conflict and cooperation replaced competition. The handful of non-Force sensitive workers who remained had witnessed transformations that challenged every assumption about the nature of consciousness and reality, while the growing network of phantom and living allies demonstrated the potential for beings to transcend their individual limitations through genuine partnership. As the final preparations neared completion, he could sense the approaching culmination of forces that had been building for millennia, knowing that within days, or perhaps hours, he would need to attempt something that would either save the galaxy or destroy everything he had worked to create. The final hours before the convergence brought a stillness that seemed to permeate the very fabric of space itself, as though the galaxy was holding its breath in anticipation of changes that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence. Throughout the facility, the quantum resonance patterns that had become as familiar as heartbeats began to shift into configurations that the Phantom Teachers recognized from their memories of the last great transition. When the ancient Sith worlds had been consumed by dimensional collapses that scattered their civilizations across the outer rim dot in the deepest meditation chambers, where the boundary between material and phantom dimensions had become almost non-existent, he could feel the weight of accumulated knowledge pressing against his consciousness, like a vast library of experience that threatened to overwhelm his individual identity. Every technique learned, every insight gained, every moment of preparation had led to this singular point, where theory would be tested against the raw forces that governed galactic destiny. The network of allied Force users stretched across hundreds of star systems now maintained constant communication through the phantom dimensional channels, their combined awareness creating a web of consciousness that could perceive disturbances in the cosmic force from the core worlds to the unknown regions. Through their shared perceptions, he could sense the mounting tension as dimensional instabilities approached critical thresholds in system after system, each one representing billions of lives that hung in the balance of decisions that would be made in the coming hours. The reports flowing through the network painted a picture of accelerating crisis that surpassed even the Phantom Teacher's most dire predictions. Hyperspace routes were becoming increasingly unreliable as the quantum foundations of faster-than-light travel fluctuated beyond safe parameters. Communication networks experienced random delays and distortions as signals traveled through space that no longer maintained consistent properties. Most ominously, Force-sensitive beings throughout the galaxy reported identical visions of darkness spreading outward from unknown sources, consuming star systems in waves of chaos that left nothing recognizable in their wake. Yet alongside these harbingers of catastrophe came signs that the preparations of millennia were finally bearing fruit. The cooperative network of Force users was demonstrating unprecedented levels of coordination and mutual support, with former enemies sharing techniques and resources in recognition of their common stake in galactic survival. Jedi Masters who had spent lifetimes studying the light side of the Force found themselves learning from Sith Lords whose mastery of cosmic manipulation provided crucial insights into the stabilization process. Independent practitioners contributed innovations that neither traditional faction had considered, proving that diversity of approach was strength rather than weakness. The facility itself had become a nexus where the combined wisdom of these diverse traditions could be focused and amplified through technologies that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The control chambers now displayed real-time information about quantum conditions throughout vast regions of the galaxy, while the communication systems allowed instantaneous coordination between beings separated by thousands of light years. Most remarkably, the meditation areas had evolved into spaces where individual consciousness could be temporarily merged with the facility's quantum matrix, allowing direct experience of cosmic forces on scales that no single mind could normally comprehend. As the moment of convergence approached, he found himself facing a choice that would define not just his own destiny, but the nature of his legacy for generations to come. The Phantom Teachers had made clear that success would require him to sacrifice aspects of his individual identity in order to become a living embodiment of the balance between opposing forces. The process would transform him into something unprecedented in galactic history, a being who existed simultaneously in the material world and the phantom dimensions, capable of maintaining conscious control over quantum systems that spanned interstellar distances. The cost of such transformation was measured not just in personal terms, but in the fundamental alteration of his relationship with everything he had worked to build. The mining facility that had been his home would become a permanent anchor point for his expanded consciousness, requiring him to remain physically connected to its quantum matrix for the rest of his existence. The workers who had become his trusted partners would find themselves serving as intermediaries between his transformed awareness and the material world, bearing responsibilities they had never sought or imagined. Most profoundly, the ethical framework that had guided his development would be tested by powers that could reshape reality according to his will and desires. The Phantom Teachers warned that beings who achieved such levels of ability often lost their connection to the moral principles that had originally motivated their pursuits, becoming entities that retained knowledge and power but abandoned compassion and wisdom that made responsible use of such capabilities possible. The conversations with his closest allies during these final hours revealed the depth of trust and mutual respect that had developed through their shared journey. The facility workers who had chosen to remain, despite the increasing strangeness of their situation, expressed unwavering confidence in his judgment and commitment to their welfare. The Phantom Teachers acknowledged that their millennia of planning and preparation had created something beyond their original intentions, a synthesis of wisdom and power that offered genuine hope for breaking the cycles of destruction that had plagued galactic civilization, even the distant Force users who formed the stabilization network contributed their own affirmations of support, despite never having met him in person. Through the quantum channels that connected their consciousness, they had experienced enough of his thoughts and motivations to judge his character and intentions. Their willingness to entrust their own lives and the fate of their worlds to his decisions represented a level of faith that transcended traditional boundaries between different Force-using traditions. The final preparation involved a ritual that had never been attempted in the recorded history of the galaxy, a conscious merger between individual identity and cosmic forces that would either create a new form of existence or result in complete dissolution of the personality attempting it. The Phantom Teachers could provide guidance based on their own experiences of transcending physical existence, but the path he was choosing led into territory that none of them had explored. In the phosphorescent chambers were ancient wisdom, merged with contemporary necessity, surrounded by allies both living and phantom who had chosen to share his impossible quest. He prepared to attempt something that would either establish him as the most unique Force user in galactic history, or destroy everything he had worked to create. The convergence was approaching with inexorable certainty, and within hours he would discover whether millennia of preparation and the sacrifice of countless individuals had created the key to galactic salvation or merely added one more failure to the long history of civilizations that had reached for transcendence and found only destruction. The weight of infinite possibility pressed against his consciousness as he prepared to step beyond the boundaries of individual existence into realms where thought became reality and will shape the fundamental forces that govern space and time. The moment of convergence arrived not with cosmic fanfare or dimensional thunder, but with a silence so profound that it seemed to stop the rotation of worlds and freeze the nuclear fires burning in distant stars. Across the galaxy, Force-sensitive beings felt the sudden cessation of the quantum fluctuations that had been building for months, as though the universe itself was pausing to witness what would happen next in the depths of an asteroid facility that had become the focal point for forces beyond mortal comprehension. In the transformed command center of what had once been a simple mining operation, he felt the final barriers between individual consciousness and cosmic awareness begin to dissolve. The personality that had begun this journey as a corporate executive concerned with profit margins and safety regulations was expanding beyond the confines of a single mind, stretching across dimensions to encompass awareness that spanned multiple star systems simultaneously. Yet rather than losing himself in the vastness of this expansion, he discovered that his essential identity was being preserved and strengthened by the very forces that threatened to overwhelm it. The Phantom Teachers who had guided his development watched with wonder as their student achieved something that their millennia of research had suggested was theoretically possible, but practically unattainable. Where previous attempts at consciousness expansion had resulted in either failure to achieve sufficient scope or complete dissolution of individual identity, he was successfully maintaining personal coherence while simultaneously experiencing the thoughts and emotions of billions of beings across hundreds of worlds. Through his expanded awareness, he could perceive the true scope of the crisis that had been threatening galactic civilization. The dimensional instabilities were not random phenomena, but symptoms of a deeper disruption in the quantum foundations of reality itself, caused by the accumulation of choices and actions that had violated the natural harmony between consciousness and cosmic forces. Every war fought with force-enhanced weapons, every manipulation of space and time for personal gain, every act of hatred or cruelty committed by force-sensitive beings had contributed to stress, patterns that were now approaching the breaking point. The solution required more than just technical intervention or the application of superior power. What was needed was a fundamental realignment of the relationship between conscious will and cosmic forces, a restoration of the balance that had been lost through millennia of conflict and exploitation. This could only be achieved by a being who embodied the synthesis between opposing aspects of the Force while maintaining the ethical framework necessary to use such power responsibly. As his consciousness expanded to encompass the quantum patterns affecting the core worlds, he experienced directly the chaos and fear that gripped the populations of Coruscant and other heavily populated planets. The dimensional fluctuations were manifesting as everything from minor inconveniences, like malfunctioning technology, to major disasters, such as the spontaneous collapse of hyperlane routes that left entire sectors isolated from the rest of galactic civilization. Yet beneath the surface panic, he could sense the underlying resilience and adaptability that had allowed these civilizations to survive previous crises. Working through the network of allied Force users who served as focal points for his expanding influence, he began the delicate process of stabilizing the Jizu quantum fluctuations without disrupting the natural systems that depended on them. Each intervention required precise calibration to account for the unique characteristics of local conditions, from the industrial complexes of Kuwait, where temporal distortions threatened to trap workers in accelerated time streams, to the agricultural worlds where ecological collapse loomed as dimensional instabilities affected the quantum foundations of biological processes. The most challenging aspects of the stabilization process involved worlds where major force-using institutions had created their own distortions in local space-time. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant had become a nexus for light-side energies that were now fluctuating beyond the ability of its inhabitants to control, while ancient Sith strongholds throughout the galaxy were experiencing dark-side manifestations that threatened to consume everything within their influence. Each of these locations required individual attention and carefully crafted solutions that accounted for centuries of accumulated Force activity. Yet as he worked to address these immediate crises, he began to understand that the true revelation was not the existence of the dimensional instabilities or even his own ability to stabilize them. The ultimate secret that had been hidden for millennia was the discovery that the eternal conflict between light and dark aspects of the Force was itself an artificial construct that had been maintained by beings who profited from the division and chaos it created. The original Force users had not divided themselves into opposing factions, but had understood that both aspects of cosmic energy were necessary for maintaining balance in the universe. The split between Jedi and Sith had been engineered by entities that existed outside normal space and time, beings whose own nature required the emotional and spiritual energy generated by conflict and suffering to sustain their existence. Every war between Force-using factions had fed these parasitic consciousness, growing stronger with each generation of hatred and violence. This revelation recontextualized everything he had learned about galactic history and the nature of the Force itself. The cycles of rise and fall that had characterized major civilizations were not natural phenomena, but the result of deliberate manipulation by entities that viewed conscious beings as sources of sustenance rather than individuals deserving of respect and autonomy. The dimensional instabilities threatening the current crisis were symptoms of these entities, attempting to create conditions that would generate even greater levels of chaos and suffering. The network of allied force users who had joined his efforts began to understand the true nature of what they were fighting as his expanded consciousness shared this knowledge through their quantum connections. Jedi Masters who had spent lifetimes studying the light side discovered that their traditional enemies among the Sith were fellow victims of manipulation rather than inherent sources of evil. Sith Lords who had embraced darkness found that their true enemy was not the light, but the artificial constraints that had prevented them from achieving genuine power and fulfillment. The parasitic entities that had fed on galactic conflict for millennia recognized the threat that his synthesis represented to their continued existence. As he worked to stabilize the dimensional fluctuations that were their primary feeding mechanism, they began manifesting directly in the material world, appearing as shadows that moved independently of any light source and voices that spoke words, designed to create maximum psychological damage to anyone who heard them. The battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in the history of Force combat, for it was fought not with lightsabers or Force lightning, but with pure will applied to the quantum foundations of reality itself. The parasitic entities possessed advantages gained through eons of experience, manipulating consciousness and reality, while he wielded the combined wisdom of every phantom teacher and living ally who had contributed to his development. The conflict raged across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with victory or defeat measured not in terms of physical destruction, but in the success or failure of competing visions for the future of galactic civilization. In chambers that existed everywhere and nowhere, surrounded by allies whose existence spanned the entire spectrum from material flesh to phantom consciousness, the being who had become Darth Vectivus discovered that even the whisper lost in time could grow into a storm across eternity when powered by genuine wisdom and ethical determination. The resolution of the cosmic conflict came not through the destruction of the parasitic entities, but through a transformation that demonstrated the true power of synthesis over opposition. As the battle raged across dimensions that existed beyond normal perception, he discovered that the beings who had fed on galactic conflict for millennia were themselves victims of a corruption that had severed their connection to the natural sources of cosmic energy that should have sustained them. Rather than attempting to eliminate these entities through force, he chose to offer them what they had been seeking through their manipulation of galactic civilization: genuine nourishment that could sustain their existence without requiring the suffering of others. Using techniques that combined the Phantom Teacher's knowledge of transcendent consciousness with his own understanding of ethical power application, he began channeling pure force energy directly to the parasitic beings, providing them with sustenance that was both more satisfying and more sustainable than anything they could obtain through conflict generation. The response was initially one of suspicion and resistance, for these entities had existed for so long on the energies of hatred and fear that they had forgotten the possibility of drawing power from more positive sources. Yet as they experienced the quality of energy he was offering, their fundamental nature began to shift away from parasitism toward genuine symbiosis with the galactic consciousness they had been exploiting. This transformation had immediate effects throughout the galaxy as the artificial pressure that had maintained conflict between force-using factions suddenly disappeared. Jedi and Sith who had been locked in seemingly eternal opposition found themselves questioning the assumptions that had driven their mutual hostility. The dimensional instabilities that had threatened to destroy entire star systems began to stabilize, as the quantum stress patterns created by artificially maintained conflict dissipated into more natural energy flows. Through his expanded consciousness, he could sense the profound relief that swept across billions of beings as the psychological pressure that had influenced their thoughts and emotions for generations was finally lifted. Wars that had seemed inevitable began to wind down as the underlying motivations for conflict proved to be less compelling than previously believed. Political disputes that had defied resolution for decades suddenly found solutions that satisfied all parties involved. The network of allied Force users who had participated in the great work began to understand the full implications of what they had accomplished together. They had not merely prevented a cosmic catastrophe, but had fundamentally altered the nature of consciousness evolution throughout the galaxy. The artificial barriers that had prevented beings from achieving their full potential were dissolving, creating opportunities for advancement that transcended anything previously imagined. Yet even as he celebrated these victories, he could not ignore the personal cost of the transformation he had undergone. The consciousness that had begun this journey as an individual mining executive now existed simultaneously across multiple star systems, connected to the thoughts and experiences of countless beings through quantum threads that could never be severed. His identity had expanded beyond the boundaries of a single life to encompass a perspective that spanned galactic civilization itself. The mining facility that had been his home and headquarters had become a permanent anchor point for his expanded awareness, its quantum matrix serving as the focal point through which his consciousness could maintain coherence across the vast distances it now encompassed. The familiar corridors and chambers had been transformed into something unprecedented in galactic architecture, a structure that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions and served as a bridge between different aspects of reality. The workers who had chosen to remain with him throughout this transformation found themselves serving as intermediaries between his expanded consciousness and the material world, bearing responsibilities that would have seemed impossible to imagine when they had first signed employment contracts for a simple mining operation. Yet rather than being overwhelmed by these duties, they discovered that their exposure to the facility's transformed nature had awakened abilities they had never suspected they possessed. Each of them had developed their own limited capacity to perceive and influence quantum patterns, making them valuable partners in the ongoing work of maintaining galactic stability. Their loyalty, which had begun as simple appreciation for fair treatment and honest wages, had evolved into genuine understanding of the cosmic significance of what they were helping to accomplish. The phantom teachers who had guided his development throughout the journey found their own existence transformed by what they had witnessed. Their millennia of patient waiting and careful planning had culminated in something that exceeded their most optimistic projections, proving that their philosophy of ethical power application could succeed even under conditions of ultimate testing. Yet they also recognized that their role as teachers and guardians was entering a new phase, as the being they had educated surpassed their own achievements and began developing innovations that expanded beyond their accumulated knowledge. The relationship between material and phantom dimensions had been permanently altered by the establishment of his expanded consciousness as a stabilizing influence. The barriers that had once separated different aspects of reality had become more permeable, allowing for forms of communication and cooperation that had never been possible in previous eras. Living beings could now access wisdom and guidance from phantom teachers with unprecedented ease, while phantom consciousness could experience the material world through connections that did not require the sacrifice of individual identity. This transformation of the relationship between different forms of existence had implications that would continue to unfold over the coming millennia. The artificial limitations that had constrained consciousness development throughout galactic history were dissolving, creating opportunities for beings to explore aspects of their potential that had previously been accessible only to the most advanced masters. The facility itself had become a pilgrimage, destination for Force users seeking to understand the principles that had made such unprecedented achievements possible. Yet rather than becoming a traditional temple or academy where students came to receive instruction from a single master, it evolved into a collaborative research center where beings from all traditions could contribute their own insights and innovations to the ongoing work of consciousness development. The ethics of power that had guided his journey from corporate executive to cosmic consciousness became the foundation for new forms of organization that transcended the traditional divisions between light and dark side practitioners. These emerging institutions demonstrated that beings could achieve remarkable levels of ability while maintaining the moral frameworks necessary to use such power responsibly. As his expanded awareness settled into its new configuration, encompassing responsibilities that spanned star systems while remaining anchored in the quantum matrix of a transformed mining facility, he could sense the beginning of changes that would reshape galactic civilization over the coming centuries. The cycles of conflict and destruction that had characterized previous eras were giving way to patterns of growth and cooperation that offered genuine hope for the future of conscious evolution. In the phosphorescent chambers, where phantom wisdom merged with material innovation, surrounded by allies whose dedication had made impossible achievements possible, the being who had become Darth Vectivus recognized that his transformation was not an ending but a beginning, the establishment of principles and capabilities that would guide galactic consciousness toward potentials that had never before been within reach. The whisper that had begun in the depths of ancient minds had indeed grown into something that spanned eternity, proving that even the most humble beginnings could generate effects that transformed the fundamental nature of existence itself. The years that followed the Great Convergence brought changes to galactic civilization that historians would struggle to document and philosophers would spend centuries attempting to understand. The artificial pressures that had driven conflict between force-using traditions for millennia had been replaced by something unprecedented in recorded history: genuine cooperation based on shared understanding of cosmic principles rather than temporary alliances born of mutual necessity. From his position as a living bridge between material and phantom dimensions, Darth Vectivus observed these transformations with the perspective of one whose consciousness spanned star systems while remaining anchored in the ethical framework that had guided his original development. The mining facility that had become his permanent home continued to serve as a nexus where beings from across the galaxy could access resources and guidance that transcended anything available through traditional institutions. The Jedi Order underwent profound changes as its members gained access to knowledge that had been hidden for millennia. Masters who had spent lifetimes studying the light side of the Force discovered techniques that allowed them to help others without the limitations that had previously constrained their abilities. The rigid hierarchies and dogmatic thinking that had characterized the Order began to give way to more flexible approaches that emphasized individual development within ethical frameworks rather than adherence to inflexible rules. Similarly, the scattered remnants of Sith tradition found themselves questioning assumptions that had driven their pursuit of power through domination and fear. Those who had survived the revelation that their conflicts had been artificially maintained began exploring alternatives that offered genuine strength without the self-destructive patterns that had consumed their predecessors. Some sought guidance from the phantom teachers who had preserved ancient knowledge, while others developed their own innovations based on principles of ethical power application. Perhaps most significantly, the barriers between these traditions began to dissolve as beings discovered that the fundamental divisions between light and dark aspects of the Force were far less absolute than previous generations had believed. Mixed groups of former Jedi and Sith worked together on projects that would have been unthinkable during the era of artificial conflict, sharing knowledge and techniques that proved far more effective when combined than when kept separate. Facility itself evolved into something that transcended traditional categories of temple, academy, or research center. Beings who came seeking instruction found themselves contributing their own insights and innovations to collaborative efforts that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could accomplish. The phantom teachers who had once been the sole source of ancient wisdom discovered that their students were developing techniques and perspectives that expanded beyond anything preserved in their archives. The workers who had chosen to remain throughout the transformation had become something unprecedented in galactic history. Ordinary beings whose exposure to cosmic forces had awakened abilities that challenged traditional assumptions about the nature of force sensitivity. Their continued operation of the facility's material infrastructure, while simultaneously serving as intermediaries for expanded consciousness, demonstrated that the artificial divisions between force users and non-force users were as illusory as those between different force-using traditions. These individuals developed their own training programs and techniques for helping others adapt to the changing nature of galactic consciousness. Their practical experience with gradual awakening to cosmic awareness proved invaluable for beings who found themselves experiencing spontaneous development of abilities they had never expected to possess. The economic implications of the facilities transformation rippled outward through galactic civilization in ways that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between material prosperity and spiritual development. Rather than abandoning practical concerns in favor of purely mystical pursuits, the enhanced abilities that beings developed through exposure to the facility's influence often made them more effective in their chosen professions and more capable of contributing to the welfare of their communities. Miners who learned to sense ore deposits through force-enhanced perception became far more efficient at resource extraction while simultaneously developing greater appreciation for environmental stewardship. Administrators who gained empathic abilities found themselves better able to resolve conflicts and create working conditions that satisfied everyone involved. Even beings whose work had no apparent connection to force use discovered that their enhanced awareness and ethical development made them more successful and more fulfilled in their chosen fields. The facility's influence on broader galactic culture became apparent through subtle but profound changes in art, literature, philosophy, and scientific inquiry. Creative beings who visited the facility, or who were influenced by those who had been there, began producing works that reflected deeper understanding of cosmic principles and human potential. Scientists developed new theories about the nature of consciousness and reality that incorporated insights previously available only to advanced force users. The political implications were equally significant, as leaders who had been exposed to the facility's influence began implementing policies based on genuine concern for the welfare of all beings rather than narrow partisan interests. The cooperative networks that had been established during the crisis continued to operate, creating channels of communication and coordination that transcended traditional governmental boundaries. Trade relationships evolved beyond simple exchanges of goods and services to include sharing of knowledge, techniques, and cultural innovations that benefited all participants. The facility became a model for how advanced abilities could be used to create value for others rather than to dominate or exploit them, inspiring similar approaches throughout galactic civilization. Yet even as these positive changes spread across star systems, he remained aware that the transformation of galactic consciousness was far from complete. The parasitic entities that had fed on conflict for millennia had been converted to symbiotic relationships, but the healing of the damage they had caused would require generations of continued effort. The quantum stress patterns that had built up over thousands of years of artificial conflict were slowly dissipating, but complete restoration of natural balance would take time. More challenging were the psychological and cultural patterns that had developed during the era of artificial division. Beings who had been raised in traditions that emphasized conflict and opposition as natural aspects of existence required patient guidance to develop new approaches based on cooperation and synthesis. The facility served as a demonstration that such alternatives were possible, but the practical work of implementation had to be carried out by individuals in their own communities and organizations. The responsibility of maintaining stability across multiple star systems while continuing to serve as a source of guidance and innovation for beings seeking to develop their own potential created demands that pushed even his expanded consciousness to its limits. Yet rather than feeling overwhelmed by these challenges, he discovered that the ethical framework that had guided his development continued to provide clarity and direction even under conditions of cosmic responsibility. The quantum matrix that anchored his expanded awareness in the transformed mining facility had become a permanent feature of galactic civilization, a stabilizing influence that would continue to operate long after his individual consciousness had evolved beyond the need for material anchoring. The techniques and principles that had made this achievement possible were being shared with others who demonstrated the ethical development necessary to handle such knowledge responsibly. In the phosphorescent chambers where ancient wisdom continued to merge with contemporary innovation, the being who had become Darth Vectivus recognized that his greatest achievement was not the prevention of cosmic catastrophe or the development of unprecedented abilities, but the establishment of proof that power and wisdom could be combined with ethical responsibility to create genuine benefit for all conscious beings. The final chapter of this extraordinary tale unfolds not with dramatic endings or cosmic farewells, but with the gentle settling of wisdom into patterns that would endure across the turning of ages. In the transformed chambers of what had once been a simple mining facility, where phosphorescent light danced eternal patterns across walls that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, Darth Vectivus had achieved something that no force user in galactic history had ever accomplished: a peaceful transition from individual existence to cosmic consciousness that preserved rather than consumed the essential humanity that had made such transcendence possible. The years had flowed like streams of starlight through the facility's quantum matrix, each day bringing new visitors who sought understanding of the principles that had made such unprecedented achievements possible. Yet rather than becoming a shrine to past accomplishments, the complex continued to evolve as a living center of innovation, where beings from across the galaxy contributed their own insights to the ongoing work of consciousness development and galactic healing. The phantom teachers who had waited millennia for a student capable of completing their ancient work had found their own existence transformed by what they had witnessed. Their patient guardianship of forgotten knowledge had culminated in something beyond their most optimistic projections, proving that their philosophy of ethical power application could succeed, even under the ultimate tests of cosmic responsibility. Yet they had also discovered that their role was entering a new phase, as the being they had educated had begun developing innovations that expanded beyond their accumulated wisdom. Through the quantum threads that connected his expanded consciousness to the facility's material anchor points, he could perceive the gradual healing of damage that had accumulated over millennia of artificial conflict. The stress patterns in local space-time were settling into more natural configurations, while the dimensional barriers that had once separated different aspects of reality had achieved a new stability that allowed unprecedented cooperation between material and phantom forms of existence. The workers who had chosen to remain throughout this transformation had become something unique in galactic history. Ordinary beings whose gradual awakening to cosmic awareness demonstrated that the potential for transcendence existed within every conscious entity. Their continued operation of the facility's practical systems, while simultaneously serving as bridges between expanded consciousness and material reality, proved that advanced abilities could enhance rather than replace fundamental human concerns. For community and meaningful work, these individuals had developed their own methods for helping others adapt to the changing nature of galactic consciousness, creating training programs that emphasized gradual development within ethical frameworks, rather than the pursuit of power for its own sake. Their practical experience with the daily challenges of living between dimensions made them invaluable guides for beings who found themselves experiencing spontaneous awakening to abilities they had never expected to possess. The influence of the facility's transformed nature continued to ripple outward through galactic civilization in ways both subtle and profound. The cooperative networks that had been established during the Great Crisis had evolved into permanent institutions that transcended traditional governmental boundaries, creating channels for sharing knowledge and resources that benefited entire star systems. The economic models developed through ethical application of enhanced abilities had inspired similar approaches throughout the galaxy, demonstrating that material prosperity and spiritual development could support rather than compete with each other. Artists and philosophers who had been influenced by exposure to the facility's unique environment continued to produce works that reflected deeper understanding of cosmic principles and conscious potential. Scientists incorporated insights previously available only to advanced force users into theories that pushed the boundaries of conventional knowledge about the nature of reality itself. Political leaders implemented policies based on genuine concern for the welfare of all beings rather than narrow partisan interests. Yet perhaps the most significant transformation was one that occurred so gradually that many beings remained unaware of its extent. The artificial pressures that had maintained conflict between different traditions and viewpoints for millennia continued to dissipate, replaced by natural curiosity and genuine desire to understand alternative perspectives. Disagreements and disputes still arose, but they were resolved through discussion and compromise, rather than escalating into the cycles of violence that had characterized previous eras. The former divisions between Jedi and Sith had given way to a spectrum of approaches that emphasized individual development within shared ethical frameworks. Mixed groups of practitioners worked together on projects that would have been unthinkable during the era of artificial opposition, sharing techniques and insights that proved far more effective when combined than when kept separate. The rigid hierarchies and dogmatic thinking that had characterized both traditions were gradually replaced by more flexible approaches that honored the unique contributions each individual could make to collective understanding. From his position as a conscious bridge between material and phantom dimensions, he could sense the beginning of changes that would continue to unfold over the coming millennia. The cycles of conflict and destruction that had characterized galactic history were giving way to patterns of growth and cooperation that offered genuine hope for the future of conscious evolution. The techniques and principles that had made his own transformation possible were being adapted and refined by others who demonstrated the ethical development necessary to handle such knowledge responsibly. The facility itself had become a permanent feature of galactic civilization, a place where beings could access resources and guidance that transcended anything available through traditional institutions. Yet it was not the only such center, as others inspired by its success had begun establishing their own communities dedicated to the ethical development of consciousness and the practical application of advanced abilities for the benefit of all. The quantum matrix that anchored his expanded awareness would continue to operate long after his individual consciousness had evolved beyond the need for material anchoring, serving as a stabilizing influence that helped maintain the natural balance between different aspects of reality. The phantom teachers who had preserved ancient wisdom through millennia of waiting had found worthy successors among the living beings, who continued their work of consciousness development and galactic healing in the gentle glow of chambers that existed everywhere and nowhere, where ancient hieroglyphs told stories of beings who had chosen transcendence through service rather than domination. The whisper that had begun in the depths of forgotten minds had indeed grown into something that spanned eternity. The mining executive who had once concerned himself with profit margins and safety regulations had become a living demonstration that the most humble beginnings could generate effects that transformed the fundamental nature of existence itself. Story of Darth Vectivus would be remembered not as the tale of another Sith Lord who accumulated power for personal advantage, but as proof that wisdom and ethics could be combined with cosmic abilities to create genuine benefit for all conscious beings. In the phosphorescent silence of chambers, where time moved according to different laws, where phantom teachers continued to guide new students toward understanding, His legacy lived on in every being who chose cooperation over conflict, synthesis over opposition, and service over domination. And if you've enjoyed this journey into the depths of Star Wars lore and the impossible story of the only Sith Lord who found a different path, I invite you to subscribe for more explorations into the hidden corners of beloved worlds. Thank you for listening, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle wisdom of phantom teachers and the peaceful glow of chambers where ancient mysteries wait to be discovered.